bulletin. The title is Deity or Dirt. As we go through life, we often encounter many things that raise questions in our minds. Frequently, these are related to concepts of just our being. At some point in time, most of us, raises questions and struggle with ideas of where we came from, why are we here, where are we going to, and what happens to us after we die. This evening, I'd like to talk a little about the first one, where we came from. These days, most people would acknowledge that there are only two choices to believe in to describe where we came from. The first choice being that God created us, and the second one being that we, by numerous accidents, came to be. Many people will say that you can't prove either one of them because it happened a long time ago, and you can't go back in time to test either theory. And in one sense, that's true. We can't travel back in time, so we can't prove absolutely to everyone what happened. But isn't that really the case in our lives? Things that have happened in our lives or in the past, we can't prove conclusively anymore. But it's just like in a court of law. It's proved enough to be beyond a reasonable shadow of doubt, as they say on all the TV shows. Or in business law, where I had before, the standard was what a reasonably prudent person would accept or do. Unfortunately, sometimes in the court of law, witnesses don't always tell the truth. They fabricate stories, they change their stories, they sometimes come out and flat out lie. And also, then there's, on the other side, whether it's a trial by jury or by judge, sometimes those who make the final decision have already determined what the decision is in their minds. They don't really look for proof that is beyond a reasonable doubt that a reasonably prudent person would accept. They're so biased and closed-minded that they consider anyone who holds a different understanding as being someone who is foolish and stupid. And that's what led me to my sermon topic tonight. This morning after Tony filled in for Joe, I was talking to him and he said, I'd forgotten how hard it is. Sometimes the biggest part of the battle is coming up with a topic to talk on, and then you can go from there. What led me to the sermon topic tonight was a headline. A couple of weeks ago in the news, there was a headline, Ohio Republican reps vote unanimously to let students provide wrong answers for science work. And you can see that they obviously have some bias or something going on, because not only is wrong specified, but it's put in bold, capital letters. To get a better understanding of what this headline was probably trying to infer, you can look at a follow-up article later in the day, which says, critics fear Ohio bill may allow students' religious beliefs to trump scientific facts. And a lot of times when we get in discussions with people, we believe in creation, they believe in basically dirt became people, you'll see that they tried to claim science has all these facts on their side and we have nothing. But really, when you look into it, science is unbiased. It's just something that's there, that you interpret, that you get facts from. It's really the belief system in God or the belief system in Mother Nature. And tonight, I want to look at the question of where we came from a more pragmatic examination. To use science, not to say it's creation versus science or whatever. It's really creation versus evolution and atheism. And science is just something you can look at to help you determine, just like in a court of law, you have evidence you look at to try to reach that point of beyond a reasonable shadow of a doubt. It's true that none of us can approach, this discussion from a totally free mindset that we use to go through life. You have to have some type of background, prejudices and biases built into your life. And sometimes we try to look at the details in this, and we're going to try and do that to determine what is the truth regarding where we are from. But instead of just, there'll be a lot of facts and stuff, but sometimes get discouragement talking with opponents that they would just say, well, you're stupid because you believe in God created it or there was a flood or whatever. But I want to look at more of the point of witnesses in this case. Because admittedly, the Bible doesn't say a lot about some of the scientific fields such as astronomy, etc., because it wasn't written as a science book. And they always throw that in your face. Well, it's not a science book, it's not an archaeology book. But it doesn't claim to be. And what's interesting to note is, because it is the Word of God where it does touch on these subjects, it always is the truth, and they haven't changed. The mentioned stars and constellations, etc., the Pleiades, Orion, etc., you can read these in Job 9:9, 38:31, Amos 5:8, Isaiah 40:22, and in other passages. After thousands of years, these facts are still true and evident there in the night sky. Can we say the same for science books? Let's look and see. Most of you probably know, the next slide, about our Milky Way galaxy. It's interesting to note that by about 1800, science recognized the Milky Way galaxy had a size of 8,000 by 1,500 light years. We know and had known back then that the Earth and science, our solar system, was part of the Milky Way. But from there, they went and said that it was the entirety of the universe at that time. They knew of nothing beyond the Milky Way galaxy. By 1906, they decided there was actually 23,000 by 6,000 light years. So a pretty good size in growth just by changing the facts. In 1920s, the dimensions of the galaxy was revised by scientists to 55,000 by 11,000 light years, and now it's estimated to be about 100,000 by 20,000 light years. So, if you want to take these, and they talk about kids putting answers on the test. If I had a test and say, which size is the Milky Way, A, B, C, or D, well, you could answer any of them, because at one time, that was all the facts. They were all true. And so it seems like things keep shifting for this witness, for the opponents. And the next slide is the Andromeda Galaxy. In 1907, to give you a little background, in the 1700s, there was a famous comet hunter named Charles Messier who made a list of various things that looked like little blurs or smudge marks, maybe comets that were still far away from the sun. And he made a list of these because he kept coming across them over and over and over. And the Andromeda Galaxy is actually M31 and 32, the lower little smudge on the right. That's the best we used to be able to get, that little smudge on the right, which is a companion to the Andromeda Galaxy. But because we couldn't make it out any better, it was listed along with all the other globular clusters and fuzzy things that are part of the Milky Way galaxy, the Orion Nebula and some of those. But then in 1907, it was determined that the Andromeda Nebula was actually a mistake. It wasn't a nebula. It was, in 1907, it was, the Andromeda Nebula was at a distance of 19 light years from us. And then in 1924, it was changed to 750,000 light years. So it obviously isn't in the Milky Way. In 1952, this distance was changed to 2,300,000 light years. And it's now thought to be over 2,500,000 light years and getting closer, by the way. Even though it keeps getting progressively farther away, supposedly it's coming right at the Milky Way and will eventually collide with the Milky Way. But obviously, at the rate they're backing it off, it's going to be a long time before it ever gets here. Maybe many of you in school remember that the way the Andromeda Galaxy is a spiral galaxy. They always use that as the example of what the Milky Way probably looks like. Only that it was about 2.5 times bigger than the Milky Way. Well, just last year, it was determined that it's not 2.5 times bigger, but actually about the same size as the Milky Way. But then what's 250%, among friends? As a youngster, I came across many other science facts that were really quite facts. Scientists said that Mercury always had one face to the sun. It was tidal locked, just like the moon is tidal locked to the Earth and basically shows one face to it. Well, they said Mercury only showed one face to the sun, so that one day would equal 1 year on Mercury. However, now they say the planet rotates in 58.6 Earth days, while it revolves once around the sun in 88 Earth days. Well, 58.6 does not equal 88, so it doesn't have one side locked into the sun. But as a consequence of the rate, on Mercury it takes 176 days for the sun to rise, set, and return to the same place in the sky. So that effectively means that a single day on Mercury lasts as long as 2 of its years. That's a long day. Again, the next slide talks about Venus. Scientists said that Venus also was tidal locked, had one face to the sun, it had huge water oceans, and that it was the Earth's twin planets. It was close in size, and they thought it was probably the place they could go to and find life because it was so much like Earth. It was our twin. However, Venus's orbital period is 224.6 Earth days, and unlike other planets in the solar system which rotate on their axes in a counterclockwise direction, Venus rotates clockwise, and it also rotates very slowly, taking 243 Earth days to complete a single rotation. So, instead of having a beautiful climate on Venus with beautiful oceans, and it turns out that the average temperature is a scorching 864 degrees Fahrenheit. That's pretty hot, but I'll give you a little thing to go by. It's 242 degrees above the melting point of lead. So Bones, as you go down in those pipes and have to melt the lead to get it to flow in, if you were on Venus, it'd be in a liquid state. You might be able to have a lake of lead that you just go scoop your liquid lead out of. Not only that, but at the surface, the atmospheric pressure is equal to 92 times that on the Earth. So you basically just get squished like a pot pan that you stand on. And early evidence pointed to sulfuric acid content in the atmosphere, but we now know that it's a rather small constituent in the atmosphere, and that the amounts quoted today anyway are carbon dioxide is 96.5% of the atmosphere, with the remaining 3.5 mainly nitrogen. So it's basically all carbon dioxide. Returning to Venus's backward rotation, astronomers can't really explain this. According to them, and maybe again from school you remember that the solar system supposedly was created out of this giant rotating dust cloud that sort of was in a disk form. If that were true, all the planets should be rotating in the same direction, and the planet should be in a level plane with the sun's equator. But not only is Venus not the only one rotating backwards, Uranus and Pluto do also, along with several of the planet's satellites, rotates backwards. Also, the planets don't revolve around the sun in its equatorial plane, but an angle to it. So instead of being a flat disk at the sun's equator spread out where the planets are in a level plane, it's at an angle to that, so that, for instance, Neptune's about 314 million miles above that plane. To give you an idea of how far that is, from the Earth to the Sun is 93 million miles. So it's about 3.5 times the distance from the Earth to the Sun is how far off that axis Neptune is. I'd say that's a little bit. While speaking of the solar system, another puzzle that the scientists have no answer for is why the Sun only has 4% of the total overall angular momentum in the solar system, while the planet Jupiter alone accounts for over 60% of it. Atheists like to say that the solar system is billions of years old, but again, talking about Jupiter, it radiates twice as much energy as it does receive from the Sun. So it's giving off twice as much heat and energy as it's receiving from the Sun. And Neptune radiates 2.7 times as much as it receives. So if these were really billions of years old, how could they still be doing this? They should have been cold icicles by now. Also, another fact about Jupiter is that it has too much argon, krypton, xenon, etc. from what they predict should be the case. Going back to Uranus and Neptune, according to the atheist predictions, it should take over 10 billion years for them both to have grown to their size by accretion. That's where there's an accumulation of the dust and it coalesces together and forms the planet. They're saying it should take well over 10 billion years, but yet they say the solar system is 4.5 billion years old. So how do you get these two planets there, and they're fully formed and have been for quite a while, in less than half the time they're saying is the minimum required time? They don't have an answer. They don't say much about that. Okay, the next one talks about comets. Well, I think we're pretty familiar with these. Each time a comet comes close to the Sun, it loses a percentage of its contents, which is mainly dust or a little bit of water vapor. And that's what forms the tail of the comet as it's shedding its material. It's been estimated that a typical comet can only orbit the Sun for about 100,000 years at most before completely running out of material. Actually, some comets don't even make it once around the Sun before it is destroyed. So why are there still comets? Those who believe in billions of years for the solar system have dreamed up an answer. They say there's probably a big cloud on the outer boundaries of the solar system that will occasionally rain a few comets in to replenish the long period comets which have been wiped out. It's interesting, and this is called the Oort cloud by the guy that discovered it. And you see the year he discovered it, and what did he discover? That's when it was theorized. He didn't discover anything. He just came up with this, oh, well, maybe there's something out there that's replenishing these comets. But anyway, it's interesting that on one website called Space Facts website, above the section entitled Facts About the Oort Cloud, it sets forth the following notice. The Oort cloud is a theorized shell of icy objects that lie beyond the Kepler belt. As such, the facts detailed in the page, on this page are hypothetical. What's that mean? It means the facts have been made up. There is no proof whatsoever. There's no reason to try and pass them off the truth. They say, here are the facts, but by the way, oh, these facts are hypothetical. That's not the definition of a fact. So these guys shouldn't be trying to pass them off as the truth, or shouldn't be calling them facts. Closer to us in the solar system is always the question of the Earth and the Moon. Those who oppose creation cannot really come up with a good theory of how the Moon got there, but again they maintain that it's been there for 4.3 to 4.5 billion years. Maybe some of you remember, some of us older people, of how the astronauts landed on the Moon, and one of the things they left was a laser mirror there. And what you can actually do is shoot a laser from the Earth, gets reflected back, and this helps give extremely precise measurements of the distance. And over the decades since then, many different countries have used these and have come up with exact amounts, so much so that they find that the moon moves away from the Earth about 1.5 inches every year due to tidal interaction. So you think, well, 1.5 inches is not much. So it would have been closer in, say, 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. It would have been about 800 feet closer to the Earth. That's still not much of a change considering the moon's how far away? About 250,000 miles. But there's no way for the moon to have been there 4.5 billion years. It would have been at the Roche limit 1.3 to 1.5 billion years ago. And on the bottom, the dotted line is the Roche limit. That's an actual figure distance. It's the limit that the closest distance from the center of a planet that a satellite can approach without being pulled apart by the planet's gravitational field. In this case of the Earth and the Moon, the limit's approximately 2.8 Earth radii, or if you can read that, they're about 11,500 miles. So the Moon could never have been closer than that, or it would just been crumbled up into particles and destroyed. So again, that would have happened approximately 1.3 billion years ago. So where was the Moon the additional 3,000 years? Apparently, they just decided to ignore it. They never answer that if you ask them about it. The next slide shows Earth's magnetic field. And the Earth does have a field surrounding it. It's approximated by a dipole, which is just a fancy word for like a magnet that has a north pole and a south pole. This dipole is roughly aligned with the Earth's rotation axis. That is, the north pole is relatively close to the north rotation pole. And that's why when you point a compass, it points approximately north. It aligns itself with a geomagnetic field. The universe contains radiation which is harmful to living tissue. Earth's magnetic field protects life by deflecting dangerous cosmic radiation. The Earth's magnetic field is thought to be caused by electric currents within its interior. Such currents encounter electrical resistance, so they naturally decay over time due to the resistance. We would therefore expect the Earth's magnetic field to become weaker as time progresses, and we have been able to measure the strength of the magnetic field, and not surprisingly, the Earth's magnetic field is indeed decaying. It has been determined that for about every century, the magnetic field decays by about 5%. Since the Earth's magnetic field is getting weaker as time moves forward, it must have been considerably stronger in the past. About 6,000 or 10,000 years ago, the magnetic field would have been quite strong, but still suitable for life. However, if the Earth were millions of years old, much less billions, the geomagnetic field would have been so strong that in the alleged distant past, life would have been not possible. In fact, I understand several millions of years ago, it would have been so strong that if there had been a human there, it literally would have pulled the iron right out of their blood. Going to Mercury, in 1974 and 75, Mariner 10 made multiple flybys of Mercury and discovered a magnetic field there where scientists said that there couldn't be one. Again, one reason they think there's a field around the Earth is it has a liquid core and is still moving and causing electrical currents, but they predicted that there would be no magnetic field on Mercury. It was supposed to be fried to a crisp, being so close to the sun and not have a liquid core. But when the Mariner 10 flew by there, they discovered the field there. And then in 2008, the Messenger spacecraft arrived at Mercury and discovered the magnetic field had decreased almost 8% in the 35 years or so that was between the two spacecraft's missions. At this rate, it loses about 1/2 its strength in about 320 years, so it can't be millions, much less billions of years old. What's interesting is that a creation scientist had predicted this before the flight to Mercury. In 1986, Voyager 2 flew by Uranus. Evolutionists expected the planet to have little, if any, magnetism, but again it does. 2 years before Voyager 2 arrived at Uranus, the creation physicist Dr. Russell Humphreys published a prediction of the planet's magnetism. He wrote that it would be about 100,000 times stronger than the evolutionists were predicting. When the spacecraft arrived, it verified his predictions were right and that the evolutionary predictions were wrong. So again, if the kids are taking the test, which would be the wrong answer if they wrote it down? The one that used the assumptions and how God built the solar system and was correct in his answer, or the others who were 100,000 times off? The next slide is Mars, and many of you probably remember how the planet was associated with canals. There's a globe where they used to have when they drew all these canals that were supposedly on there, and that led to a lot of theories about water being carried across the planet's surface and everything in these canals. And maybe even some of us grew up reading science fiction stories that were written through the years about them, but then you never heard about any specific conclusion to the debate. Were there canals, were there not? They didn't have a big thing that equaled the big debate. In fact, one writer, in speaking about not hearing about any resolution, said, "Hey, don't be surprised you haven't heard much about this. The controversy surrounding the Martian canals, probably the most famous episode in the history of astronomy, wasn't cleared up until the early 1970s, almost a century after the debate had begun." With a buildup like that, you're not going to get a lot of astronomers sending out notices saying, "Dear world, we're sorry, but it was all a big mistake." What's interesting that even though now there aren't canals, the pictures and data sent back by the spacecraft that have gone there prove that Mars is a very dry planet. The scientists are saying now that Mars was totally flooded at some time in the past. Even though there is limited water on Mars in the form of water vapor in the atmosphere, there's some frozen at the poles and underground. Water can't even exist in a liquid form on the surface, and for the most part, Mars is just a big desert planet, as you can see from the pictures that some of the landers have done. Compare this with the fact that the Earth is covered by water by over almost 3/4 of its surface, with a total volume of approximately 1.3 billion cubic kilometers, which, who knows metric system, it's equal to about 310 million cubic miles. That is enough to flood the planet 1.5 miles deep. Yet the atheists refuse to accept a global flood here and accept one on a desert planet. Why? Because a reasonably prudent man would accept that? No, they wouldn't accept the fact that there is a flood on a planet and it's very capable of doing it. No, the reason they don't do it is just because God said it was so. They refuse to accept the truth. I don't have time tonight to cover the myriad of other instances where the facts that we've been taught have been changed over and over. When you try to discuss with those who oppose the Bible, their most common response is, well, we just didn't know enough back then, and we've developed new instruments since then that have clarified things, and that's part of the process. Science changes. I don't know if you've ever heard that answer, but the way I would answer that would be, changes? You say, all these change? Facts don't change. Theories, stories, yeah, they change. So these facts weren't facts to begin with. If what you've taught as facts has changed, they weren't facts to begin with. And in continuing the analogy of a courtroom, if you were on a jury and there were two witnesses, one who spoke the truth and the other who was a pathological liar who kept changing his story, which would you believe? How can you tell if they're not telling the truth? There is a close parallel in Deuteronomy 18 verses 21 and 22, where instead of witnesses it is discussing prophets. When Israel had a false prophet and a true prophet, and they had opposing things that they said, well, how could they know which one God hadn't spoken through? In verse 21 and 22, the reply is, and if you say in your heart, how may we know the word the Lord has not spoken? When the prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the word does not come to pass or come true, that is the word that the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You need not be afraid of him. Even a person on the other side, when being honest, will end up saying the same thing. Perhaps some of you have heard of Isaac Asimov. He was a relatively famous author and scientist. Wrote a lot of science fiction, and he once wrote complaining about science and how conjectural and non-factual it was, even though that's what he was a scientist. Many of his stories have been built on the facts that science had later proved not to be true. Of course, some of his critical fans would write in and say, why do you have things like oceans of Venus or one side facing the sun of Mercury and all these so-called facts? So he had to defend himself in his writing. And so he called the field of science, quote, the cold and rigid apostle of truth as we now see it. That is, even he as an atheist knew that their truths, their facts, would change. And God knew that people who are following Satan, the father of lies, would also tell false facts. There are specific warnings for us to read as New Testament Christians. In 1 Timothy 6:20 in the KJV it says, keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science falsely so called. Because again, science backs up everything God says. But false science, where people twist and call things facts that are not facts, is what he's warning us about. We have looked a little at the wonders in the sky tonight. Do they display evidence for God or for a bunch of dirt improving itself? In Romans 1:19 through 23, Paul writes, for what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. As for students writing down things that conflict with atheists' false ideas, I think maybe the headline should have been changed to, Critics fear Ohio bill may allow students scientific facts to trump false ideas, facts, opinions, and theories. Tonight, I can tell you that even though the facts we hear from the secular world may vary from day to day, that some facts don't change. Jesus is still the way, the truth, and the life. The gospel is still the good news. The fact remains that he loves you, he died for you, and wants to be able to come back and take you to be with him forever. Whether you're not a Christian or you're a Christian that is stop following him or doing things that you should be doing, if you have any need whatsoever, please come forward as we stand and sing the invitation song.